Hello, my name is LoG's, and welcome to part 4 of my practical guide to using Diminished 7. Just a quick recap. In part 1, we went over the basic ways to build and construct Diminished 7 ideas around the fretboard. In part 2, we started talking about using these Diminished 7 ideas as a transitional sound into a minor chord. And then in part 3, we went over the most common place that you can naturally find this Diminished 7 sound, and that, of course, is in the classic transitional dominant 7th chord that leads you to a minor chord, which is always a dominant 7th built on the 5 of the minor chord you are traveling to, also known as a secondary dominant or known as simply a 5 of a minor chord. It's very important that you understand all of these concepts, which you can find in the playlist above and below in the description, because we're going to use all of these strategies again today, but in a different context. We're going to be playing over a backing track with 2 different minor chords. Not only do we have 2 different minor chords, each of those minor chords is going to have a different Diminished 7 transitional sound. So we'll play one Diminished 7 sound into one minor chord and then a different Diminished 7 into the other. To demonstrate this, I put a solo together over a backing track that does exactly this. 2 minor chords looping over and over again. And as usual, every time I use this Diminished 7 transitional sound, you'll see this symbol pop up in the corner. Let's first check out this solo and then we'll get started. All right, so let's get started. The first thing we have to go over is the chords in the chord progression. And like I mentioned, there are 2 minor chords happening just on a loop, and those minor chords are specifically B flat minor for 4 bars and then E flat minor for 4 bars. So of course, they're not just normal minor triads. I've got some extra notes in there, like I think one of the chords I'm playing flat 7 and 4. And then maybe the E flat has a 2 in it. Those voicings don't necessarily matter, because what you would play over that type of minor, like a slightly thicker minor, is more or less what you would play, or at least more or less what I would play over standard minor triad. So those kind of thicker minor chords don't really change things, at least for me. So the other thing to pay attention to is the movement of the chords that we're playing. So you might say, man, B flat minor, E flat minor, those are just not common chords at all. And first of all, they are a lot more common than you might think, but the actual roots, the fact that it's B flat minor moving to E flat minor, doesn't really matter. What matters more is the movement. So let's check out the movement that I'm playing right here. I'm playing a minor chord and dropping, if you can see, I'm playing just the standard bar chord on the E string right here, B flat right there. And I'm simply dropping down a string and playing the next minor chord on the A string, same fret. That would be the E flat minor chord, right? So in music terms, let's forget about guitar terms, right? It's of course fine to think about it as simply moving down a string, but forget about guitar terms and let's just think music terms. What are we actually doing right here? We are playing a minor chord and moving up in pitch a 4th. This is always the distance between a note and its 4th on guitar, from there to there, from the E string to the A string. In this case, that would yield a B flat and an E flat. This movement is the exact same thing if I played, for example, A minor to D minor. Way more common exact chords for guitar players, but the movement is the same thing. A minor chord, up a 4th, minor chord. Or if I played G minor to C minor chord, up a 4th, minor chord. But what's also the same is if I played the same movement, a minor chord, but instead of going up a 4th, I went down a 5th. So for example, that would be the same thing as me playing E minor, down a power chord, which is down a 5th, to A minor. That's actually the same movement. The only difference is the first chord of the batch is higher in pitch than the second chord, but the movement is the same thing, right? I could do this. I could play E up a fourth to A, or E down a fifth, down a power chord to A again. It will yield the same thing. The movement is way more important than the literal chords that I'm playing, because the concepts that we're talking about today can be applied to any pair of minor chords that have this exact same movement, right? So the fact that it's B flat and E flat doesn't really matter. It's the movement that you want to pay attention to. So how would we look at this from a key? Most people would say, if I go back to our actual chords, B flat minor, E flat minor, most people would say we're in the key of B flat minor and we're simply playing 1 and then 4 in the key of B flat minor. Totally cool with that. You can absolutely do that if that makes sense to you. Personally, I do not look at it like that. I always look at it from the perspective of the major key. So in this case, that would be D flat major is our actual, that would actually be what I would call 1. And B flat and E flat would be 6 and 2. So imagine if we played a progression like B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat. That would be 6, 2, 5, 1 in this key. We're just doing that, but just not playing the last two chords. We're just playing the first two, 6 and 2, over and over again. This is very valuable for me, at least, because for me, the sound of the 6th chord is always a specific thing, minor with 2 and flat 6. And then the sound of the 2 chord, E flat, is always a specific thing, minor with 2 and natural 6, minor pentatonic with 2 and natural 6. That's kind of besides the point. That's, for another video. I think I have another video on that topic if you're interested. Regardless, however you want to think about it, whatever makes sense to you, you do that. None of that really matters because the tactics we're going to be using today don't really care about what key you're in. They only care about what is the chord that we are traveling to. That's the only thing that really matters right now. And the chords that we are traveling to in this backing track are simply B flat minor and E flat minor. So the other thing that's important to note is the fact that there is no actual diminished chord happening in the backing track. It is literally just 4 bars of B flat minor, 4 bars of E flat minor, just repeated over and over again. There is no diminished 7 happening. There's no dominant 7th happening either, like we talked about in the previous video. So the only thing that's actually playing the diminished 7 transition sound is me, or the soloist, or the improviser, right? So because of that, in my solo that you just heard, I am playing diminished in a very kind of minimal way because I know that that sound is not actually happening in the track. And if I were to play a lot of it, it might give a sound that is a little bit more out or more kind of dissonant than what most people might want. So what I'm doing is just playing a tiny little touch of it right before the next chord, just kind of nudging your ear into that next chord, which is what we're going to talk about here in a second. Just very simple ways to just gently play the diminished 7 sound to get your ears into that next chord without overplaying it. Because over this kind of track, again, because that diminished sound is not happening, I'm the only one, or the improviser, the lead player, is the only one playing that diminished sound. So if you play a lot of it, it can definitely have more of a clash than you might want. So that's kind of what we're doing. And in fact, when I'm playing over this backing track, I am only playing that diminished 7 sound during the final bar right before we transition into the next chord. I think at one point I play the entire bar of diminished, but most of the time I'm probably playing 2 beats worth of diminished 7. Very, very minimal, again, just to give you a little nudge into that next chord. And the other thing that's really important, and this is what we really have to focus on in this lesson today, is what the diminished 7 sound that I'm playing actually is. And this is where it gets a little tricky. The diminished 7 sound that I'm playing is the sound that leads you into the next chord. So what does that mean? The chord will be B flat minor. And during the final bar of this chord, I am actually playing the diminished 7 transition into E flat minor. So I'm actually thinking about E flat minor and playing the diminished transition to get into this chord before it happens, during a totally different chord, right? So the chord will be B flat minor, but I'm actually thinking about the diminished to get me into the next chord. And it's the same thing when we travel back to B flat. During the E flat minor, I'm actually going to play, during the final bar of this chord, I'm going to play the diminished that takes me back to B flat. Again, I have to think about a chord that's not happening. I have to think about B flat minor during an E flat minor chord, right? So that's where things can get a little bit tricky if you're not used to this. And again, this has to do with the ability of playing over chord changes, right? It's such an intensely important topic because if you're the type of player who just basically sits there in what I call autopilots, meaning you're just playing the scale of the key and you're not actually paying attention to the chords when they change, exactly when they change, this type of thing can be very difficult because there's a chance you haven't developed the ability to have the chord progression passively in your mind. You have to have, when those chords change, passively in your mind so you can start to make choices like this, so you can start to actually think about the next chord before it happens. So I've talked about this before, but I'll demonstrate this. So I'm going to play the backing track right now, and what you'll notice is I can keep track of the backing track while I still talk. That means I have it passively in the back of my mind. So check this out. I'll just play it real fast. While it's going, I'm going to tell you when the chords will change. There's the B flat. Again, I can continue having this conversation because the chords are changing in the back of my mind, E flat right now. And now we're on E flat. So as I'm playing, I'm thinking about E flat, but I'm also planning ahead to the B flat that's going to happen right now. So see, I'm still talking. I'm not actually really paying attention to the chord progression. I'm letting it play, but it's subconsciously in the back of my mind. Bam, there's E flat. Because of that, I can make choices without getting lost because that progression is still lodged in the back of my head. B flat right there. Really important that you are able to do that. And the only way to build that ability is to play over a backing track that's got chord changes and you're really, really paying attention to those chord changes. If you're not used to it, it'll take a second to get comfortable. But once you do it enough, what I just demonstrated right there will happen to you as well. You're so used to hearing those chord changes. You're so used to feeling the time, knowing when that next chord changes, that it's happening passively in your mind and you don't have to pay attention to it. And you can instead pay attention to things like, how do I play this diminished 7 transition sound into that next chord? Because in order to make these diminished transitions work really well, you've got to play them in a way where they resolve right on time. You don't have to resolve perfectly on time, but in the early stages of learning this sound, you really do, so you can hear that resolution. Otherwise, it might kind of sound just like a couple dissonant notes randomly happening. You don't want that sound. You want those dissonant notes, those clashing notes to have a purpose. You want them to take you, to nudge your ear to resolve into that next chord. So what I'm going to do actually with that in mind, I'm going to play the solo one more time and I'm going to have a diagram on the screen that's showing you kind of to be like a circle instead of, 4 bars of B flat, 4 bars of E flat. It'll be kind of a circle so you can see how the progression is just a basic loop like this. And you'll see the progress of my solo. And whenever that diminished 7 sound comes in, you'll notice it's right before the next chord. And that diminished sound is going to be the diminished of that next chord. So I need to be thinking ahead. So with that in mind, let's listen to the solo one more time and pay attention to when I'm using those diminished 7 transition ideas taking me into the next chord. right, so now we have a basic understanding of the flow of this progression, the movements that are happening, where we are adding in this little hit of a diminished 7 sound, getting us into that next minor chord. Let's start to develop some strategies or really some mindsets that we can put ourselves in to easily access these diminished 7 sounds. So right now we're going to go over the first strategy, which is essentially what we did in part 2, where we are thinking about the minor chord that we are traveling to and getting into the diminished sound based on that minor chord. So of course, like we just went over, the backing track is B flat minor. And the next chord that we were playing after that is E flat minor. So let's say we're soloing B flat minor, just playing whatever we want to play, and we know the E flat minor is about to happen. So what do we do? How do we start getting into that diminished sound that takes us to E flat minor? All we have to do is what we did in part 2. You take a look at E flat minor, the chord, and you simply start your diminished 7 ideas on that chord's 7, 2, 4, or flat 6. It's exactly what we've been talking about throughout most of this series. Those are the starting locations for the diminished 7 sound that takes you into that chord. So what we need to do as we are soloing during the B flat minor chord, as it's happening, towards the end of that run of the 4 bars of that chord, we should start looking for the 7, 2, 4, or flat 6 of E flat, of the next chord, right? So what are some ways that we can easily do that? We're playing B flat minor, doing whatever we want to do. So what I personally start to do is I look for E flat, of course, the root of the next chord. That's the 1. But I also look for the 5 of that chord, which would be B flat, which also happens to be the root of the chord that's still happening, the B flat. Now, why would I look for those 2 notes? Mostly because the starting locations for our diminished 7 sound, again, E flat, 7, 2, 4, and flat 6, all of those notes are pretty close to either the root E flat or the 5th B flat in this case. For example, if I want to start on the 7 as my starting location, again, I'm traveling into E flat minor. All I need to do is look for E flat, the root of that chord, which I see one here, I see one there, all these different E flats, and I do what? Go back a fret, because that will always take me to that chord's 7, E flat's 7, which is D in this case. So if I'm playing E flat, right, or I'm not necessarily playing E flat, I'm looking at E flat, I see an E flat right here, move back a fret. Now I'm on one of the diminished 7 starting locations. So what can I do right here? How about just a very simple run of the arpeggio? Right, that's a note, next string, same string, next string, all minor thirds, of course, and I will resolve like my ear wants me to, like we've talked about in the previous videos, to the actual E flat chord. So you see that strategy? I'm still playing B flat. It's still a B flat chord, but I know E flat's coming up. I look for E flat, the root of the next chord, and I go back 1 fret. That takes me to the 7, a starting location for this diminished. What else can I do? If I look for that root again, the E flat, same root, but instead of going back a fret to 7, I go up 2 frets, up a whole step. That takes me to 2, another starting location for this sound, getting into the E flat chord. So here I am playing B flat minor, and I start to look for E flats, right? I see one right here. There's the root of the next chord. Earlier, I went back a fret, started diminished on the 7, but now I'm going to go up 2 frets, up a whole step, start diminished on the 2. And I could do something really simple like, right, now I'm on E flat. Notice I'm always trying to resolve into that next chord, E flat minor in this case. So what was that? Just a little diminished arpeggio, just up and down. Nothing terribly exciting, but it does its job of getting us into that next chord with this very significant sound. So you see that strategy. I know the next chord is E flat, so I'm looking for my E flats, the root of the next chord, which is something that, you know, if you don't know the fretboard, if you don't know where these particular letters are, that's definitely something to practice, although there is something else we can look at here in a moment, which I'll talk about. But I'm looking for that E flat, and And because I can find that E flat, I have 2 of the starting locations for diminished. I can go back a fret, that's the 7, starting location. Or I can go up 2 frets, that's the 2, another starting location. So if I know where the root of the next chord is, I've got 2 of the 4 starting locations. Now, what I'm also going to visualize is what I mentioned earlier. I want to visualize the root of E flat because that gives me the location of the 7 and the 2, like we just talked about. But I also want to visualize the 5 of E flat, which would be B flat in this case. Why? Because by visualizing the 5, that gives me the location of the other 2 diminished 7 starting locations, which would be what? In total, 7, 2, 4 and flat 6. 4 and flat 6 are pretty close to 5, right? So if I can visualize the 5th of the next chord, in this case, B flat, the 5th of the E flat chord, I, by proximity, know where 4 and flat 6 are. Because this is 5, 4 is always back a whole step. That's 4, start a very simple diminished idea. Little arpeggio or something. And then here's 5 again, visualizing that note. Flat 6 is simply up a fret. So I could do another very simple diminished idea, looking at that note, starting there. Both of those starting locations will again push my ear very kind of discreetly, if I just play a little idea like that, into that next E flat minor chord. Right? So all you really need to do, now, of course, when you practice this, you'll have a bunch of other strategies to find these notes, but in the early stages, the easiest way to find these starting locations is just look for the root of the next chord or the 5th of the next chord, because all of those diminished 7 starting locations will be nearby those 2 notes. If you can see the root, by proximity, you can see the 7 or the 2. And if you can visualize the 5th of that following chord, the next chord, by proximity, you see the 4, back a whole step, and the flat 6, up a fret. Right? So in the early stages, I would do that. That's a really easy way to lock in to that sound. Now, again, you have to remember, we're doing this during a chord that's not E flat minor. We're doing this during B flat minor, during the final bar or so of that chord. So you need, again, to plan ahead. You need to start thinking about that next chord as you travel. Now, there's some other kind of interesting things that you might notice. And this is something that we'll talk about in the next portion of this video, but you can start to see maybe some little connections. For example, if I'm playing B flat minor and I'm traveling to E flat, right? Well, I can say, well, let's take a look at the E flat, right? That's the root of the next chord, and I want to start diminished. That takes me there. So I can start on 7, 2, 4, or flat 6. You might notice, hey, wait a minute. The 2 of E flat is F. That's the 5th of B flat minor, the chord that I'm currently playing, right? So you might see a little shortcut right there. You can say, well, during B flat minor, all I actually have to do is target the 5th of this, which will be the 2 of the next chord, a diminished 7 starting location. That might make things a little bit easier because you can actually still think about the chord you're currently on. Like I could be playing B flat minor, slide up to the 5. I can see that's the 5 of B flat, 1, 5. And I can say, hey, wait a minute. This is a diminished 7 starting location for the next chord. So I can just hit this note, do a little diminished 7, and that will take me into the E flat. So you might start to notice little connections, little shortcuts. Now, a lot of these shortcuts we're going to talk about in the next portion of this video, but keep your eyes open for that. This is something also that's really important. Remember earlier on, I mentioned how important it is to understand this movement of chords, right? What are we doing? A minor chord, up a 4th to another minor chord. The reason why I mentioned how important this movement is because any tactic or trick or shortcut or strategy that you develop with this pair of chords, B flat minor, E flat minor, can be copied and pasted to any other chord progression that has the same movement. So all the stuff you're doing right now, traveling to B flat minor, from B flat minor to E flat minor, can be copied and pasted from A minor to D minor, same strategies. From G minor to C minor, same strategies, right? Because the actual literal chord names don't matter as much as the movement. The movement, if that's the same, you can take all of these ideas, copy and paste them in whatever way you want. in ways that make sense to you, and it will always work. This kind of chord progression movement is pretty common too. I mean, this is kind of like the first two chords of like a minor blues, right? We've all heard minor blues progressions, our whole lives. These two chords are happening in there, right? So you can even use these tactics in something as simple as a minor blues, because that movement, a minor chord going up a fourth or down a fifth to another minor chord, right, is the movement we're talking about. Anytime you see that movement, you can use these strategies, these little diminished seven chords, taking you into those chords as they happen. So what we just talked about was coming from B flat minor, moving into E flat minor, right? Whenever a couple ways to locate those notes, you simply look at E flat and find it's 7, 2, 4, or flat 6. Start diminished 7 on any of those notes, and that will take you into the E flat. Now, what happens if we're traveling back to B flat? So we're on E flat now, and we're playing kind of the second 4 bars of the loop of the backing track, and we're going back to B flat. The strategy is exactly the same. What do? The chord is E flat. That's the chord we are currently playing, but we need to start visualizing and thinking about B flat as we come back to the beginning. And not just B flat, but what? B flats, 7, 2, 4, and flat 6. The diminished starting locations to get you into that chord, right? And the strategy is exactly the same. All we need to do is look at the root of B flat. By proximity, that will give us B flats 7 and 2 starting locations for diminished 7. And we can look at B flats 5th, right? That will give us, by proximity, the other starting locations. There's the 5th. We can start on the 4, back a whole step, or up a fret to flat 6, right? It's the same exact approach. We're not doing anything different. This is exactly what we talked about in part 2. The only tricky thing is we have 2 different chords with 2 different diminished 7 chords or diminished 7 sounds leading into those chords, and we need to sort of think about that chord before it happens to be able to transition. So as you're practicing getting back into the B flat minor, you also want to look for any visual shortcuts that you can use to make the process easier, like we did moving into the E flat. So just to recap what that was, we noticed that we're soloing over B minor, of course, and we're about to hit E flat minor, and we want to diminished 7 transition into that chord, and we notice F, the 2 of E flat minor, one of the diminished 7 starting locations, is also the 5th of B flat minor, the chord that we're currently on. So that's a shortcut. We can simply play B flat minor like we normally would and look at its 5th, knowing that that is also the 2 of the next chord, and we can just start diminished 7 right there. We play B flat minor, jump to its 5th, play diminished, and then we're into the E flat minor chord. Well, are there any shortcuts or little easy visual cues that we can use moving from E flat minor back to B flat? There's one super easy one. Remember, what are we targeting? What are we looking for? When we're traveling to B flat minor, we're looking for diminished on its 7, 2, 4, and flat 6, right? We'll take a look at 4, the 4th of B flat, one of our starting locations. What is that note? E flat. That's the root of E flat minor, the root of the chord that we're still playing. So that's unbelievably easy, because what we can do is over E flat minor, we play E flat minor stuff, whatever we want to play. And then when we're ready to transition back to B flat minor, we can just play, instead of E flat minor, we can play E flat diminished. We can sit on that same root of E flat because we know it's also the 4th of B flat, and that's a diminished 7 starting location. I mean, that's super easy to do. We basically don't have to look at anything else other than E flat for that entire run of 4 bars. We play E flat minor for normal, the length of the normal E flat minor chord. When we're ready to get into the diminished 7 sound that brings us back to B flat, we just look at the same E flat and play diminished. So I can play up here, E flat minor, looking at E flat, my root, and when I'm ready, I play diminished. And I'm right back to B flat. So that's a super easy shortcut. Again, there are a lot of these little shortcuts that will pop up in your mind. You want to just start looking for them as you're playing. And remember, like I mentioned earlier, if the movement that you are playing is the same thing as what we're talking about right now, so a minor chord, up a fourth, or down a fifth to another minor chord, these shortcuts and connections will always be the same. So that makes things a lot easier as you're navigating this progression. So right now I'm going to play over the backing track and just demonstrate some really, really simple ideas by targeting specific notes. So right now I'm going to play over the track and only target the 7 of the next chord. This is probably the easiest one because all you need to do is look for the root of the next chord. So E flat or B flat, whichever chord is happening or about to happen, and you literally just move to the left 1 fret. That's the 7 starting location. I'm going to play a super, super simple diminished idea and just casually resolve. Again, like I've talked about before, I don't think it's a good idea to start going wild with your Yngwie Malmsteen diminished licks until you can really smoothly resolve out of them in time, okay? So there's B flat right here. Really simple. Watch this. I'm going to describe that in a second. So let me just describe as I'm playing. The first one was actually longer than I probably wanted to, but it still sounded good. The first one I played right there, I was playing B flat minor. Before the E flat happened, I spotted the E flat, which is simply here, which is also really easy to find, right? Because where are these roots? We talked about it. If this is B flat, E flat's just down a fourth, or up a fourth, right? Just down a string, I should say. So I'm playing B flat right here. E flat's just, again, down a string, pull back a fret. That's a diminished starting location, the 7. So I targeted the 7 and played straight diminished and then resolve up to this E flat up top. And then when B flat was about to happen, I saw B flat. What did I do? Go back a fret to its 7, a little diminished, take you into there. So I'll try to call it off as I'm playing and see how well I do. B flat. Watch this. E flat, back a fret. E flat. Gonna do the same thing to B flat. Here's a B flat, back a fret. I'll repeat that. Experimenting with some rhythm stuff. Now, again, you can really tell the potency of these diminished 7 sounds when I play them. They're pretty strong, right? So if you don't resolve out of them, they can sound kind of wonky when you get into them because some of these notes are going to be very strong. But if you resolve, again, it's just that nudge of your ear into the next chord that can be pretty nice. I'm also kind of really digging into those notes quite a bit right here. Sometimes maybe a little flourish of notes might be a little bit more palatable. Something like that. Just like a quick little run of it, so you're not really sitting on these notes for that long. If you're noticing like, man, these notes are really strong, just a little flurry of those notes into the next chord might be what you want to do right there. But notice every time I played, I strategically chose to start my diminished idea on the 7 of the next chord every time I did that. And it's going to sound super strong. You might already kind of see why it sounds so strong, but I can show you. Let's say I'm on B flat minor, and right there, what did I just do? Traveling to E flat, and I chose to start my diminished idea on E flat's 7, one of the starting locations, right? Pretty normal. But what is that note of the chord that's still happening? The chord is B flat. We're traveling to E flat, starting on its 7, diminished right here. What is that note of B flat? That's the 3, the major 3. So when we do this sound, we're actually playing the major third of B flat during B flat minor, right? So that's essentially like playing this, right? A minor third plus the major third, right? Of course, not a completely unheard of sound. I mean, if you've ever heard like one of these before, you know, like a a B flat with a normal third and a flat 3 at the same time. Many people call this sharp 9, right? Not an unheard of sound, but definitely pretty strong, right? So you're going to be practicing this and you're going to be like, whoa, this is really strong, because it is. But again, it's not necessarily how the sound is functioning in the moment. It's how the sound is taking you into the next chord. And that's why it's so important to practice this, always looking ahead and making sure that you resolve. Because if you resolve cleanly, the sound will be perfect. It will be pretty strong, but it's a really nice flavor, again, just to shove your ear into that next chord. So, and then again, you can also do some other things, like right there, I am strategically doing what? Starting my idea on the 7 of both chords before they happen. In this situation, as you just saw, that yields a really strong note. That yields me starting on D, the major third of B flat, when B flat is actually playing D flat, the minor chord. So together you're kind of hearing that. So what I could do, if that's a little too strong for me, maybe I can try another starting location, getting into that E flat chord, right? So maybe I can just remember, it's a little strong, let me try something else. So what else could I do? Here's E flat. Again, that's not actually happening. It's a chord that's about to happen. I just started an idea on the 7, kind of strong. So I can start an idea on the 2. What is 2 of the actual chord that's still happening? That's the 5th of B flat. So that one might be a little bit more palatable entry point into this diminished sound, because it's already happening in the chord. That one might be kind of cool. So I can play B flat. Right? We talked about that one earlier. That's like a nice little, sneaky transition into diminished. You slide up to the 5 of B flat, a sound you're probably already playing, but then you come around the back, sneakily turn it into a diminished 7 chord, right? Which takes you into the next E flat. So that could be a pretty cool tactic as well. I'll try that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start my ideas, both of them, leading into E flat and leading back into B flat on the 2, on that starting location of the 2 of the next chord. Let's try that. So B flat. E flat starting on its 2 right here. Pretty palatable. B flat, it's 2. Not too bad. Flat on its 2. Right? And again, just experimenting. Sometimes I'll play a longer phrase. Sometimes I'll play a shorter phrase. I'm just trying to train my ears to hear these notes so I can start to come up with some, more organic melodies that aren't necessarily just up and down arpeggios. Although up and down arpeggios, like I've basically been doing right here, are very effective, right? So don't feel bad if you're just running the shapes up and down. They are very effective, especially if you're using them to resolve into the next chord, right? So that's strategy number 1. What do? We think about the 2 minor chords we're playing, and before that next minor chord is about to happen, we start to visualize it. We start our diminished ideas on the next chords, 7, 2, 4, or flat 6. And we can experiment with which notes maybe sound more palatable when we lock onto them and land on them, figure out what our ears want to hear, and move forward like that. So keep in mind, what we're doing right now is only thinking about the next minor chord. That's how we're getting into this diminished sound. So that's strategy number 1, which is essentially what we did in part 2 of this series. Now, the next strategy is essentially what we did in part 3 of the series. And instead of thinking about the minor chord we are traveling to, we're going to think about the dominant 7th chord that would take us into that next minor chord, even though that chord is not happening. So like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, if you have not seen part 3 of the series, I highly recommend you watch it, because the topic of that video is essentially the strategy that we are going to use right now. So the strategy we just used was thinking about the minor chords that are happening, just the normal chords that are happening in the chord progression, but we have to think about the next chord before it happens. And then we think about that next chord, start our diminished ideas on that chord's 7, 2, 4, or flat 6, like what we just talked about. But now what we're going to do is not necessarily think about the next minor chord. We're going to think about the dominant 7th that will take us into that minor chord. And that dominant 7th is the sound of a 5 of, or you can call it a secondary dominant. Very simply, sounds like this. If I'm on B flat minor, turn this up. If I'm on B flat minor and I'm traveling to E flat minor, of course, the next chord of the chord progression, what I'm going to do is think, what is E flat minor's 5 chord? What is the dominant 7th transitional chord that takes me into E flat? Very simple. It's a dominant 7th chord built on the 5 of E flat. That's why that's why we call these chords 5 ofs, because it's a dominant 7th chord built on the 5th of the chord that you are moving to. Okay, so if I'm moving to E flat, right? What is the 5th of E flat? Very easy way to find it, just go up a power chord, right? There's E flat, our root. The 5th of E flat is B flat, which I'll also play down here. So if I want to play this 5 of E flat, this dominant 7th transition, that chord would be a B flat dominant 7th chord, right? This is the 5 of E flat minor. It will always be that too, that transitional dominant 7th. It's where you hear all these kind of moves. I mean, this is a sound that's been happening for 400 years. A very, 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 very common sound. And this also happens to be one of the easiest places to spot in music where diminished 7 naturally exists, right? Because this type of dominant 7th chord, a dominant 7th that moves to minor, often has what built inside of it? A flat 2. Right? We talked about this in part 3. It's why you need to see that video if you haven't seen it. So that means if I play B flat 7, but with flat 2, which is just up a fret from the root, I'll pop it on top, right? That chord is literally a diminished 7 chord. There it is right there. If I take B flat, dominant 7th, and take the root and replace it with flat 2, I am now playing a diminished 7 chord. Right? That's the easiest location for diminished 7 to naturally exist, on this dominant 7th sound that's built on the 5 of the minor chord you are traveling to, right? So that means, as a lead player, if I know I'm traveling to E flat minor, before it happens, I can start thinking, or what I like to call pretending, that it's a B flat dominant before. Right? So in my mind, even though I know the chord progression is 4 bars of B flat minor, 4 bars of E flat minor, I'm going to start pretending that it's actually 3 bars of B flat minor, 1 bar of B flat dominant. Okay? And I'm going to do the same thing for the next 4 bars. Right? 3, instead of 4 bars of E flat minor, 3 bars of E flat minor in my mind, and then a bar of the 5 of B flat as we travel back to the first chord. What's the 5 of B flat? Here's B flat minor, right? We're traveling back to this chord as the whole progression starts over. What's the 5 of this? Here's B flat, go up a power chord. That's always the 5. This is an F, so I will play F dominant 7, right? That chord's not happening. Definitely not happening in the track, right? But it's happening in my mind. I'm pretending that's the chord for the final bar, because what I can then do is play that chord or play the diminished 7 sound from that perspective, right? Which was what? We talked about this in part 3. Check it out. If I am playing B flat dominant, how do I get that connected diminished 7 sound to this? Very simple. We talked about this last time. I simply look at this chord, start diminished 7 on its 3rd chord tone, super easy to locate. On its 5th, another chord tone, super easy to locate. On its flat 7, another chord tone, super easy to locate. Or on its flat 2. Also, not necessarily a chord tone, but really easy to locate because I can definitely see the root and I go up 1 fret. So look at what these notes are, right? I'm thinking B flat dominant, and I'm starting diminished on B flats 7, 5, or excuse me, I'm spoiling what I'm about to talk about. On B flats 3rd, 5th, flat 7, and flat 2. Well, guess what those notes are? Those are the same starting locations as we just talked about. Those are E flats, 7, 2, 4, and flat 6, right? I'll say that one more time. B flat dominants, 3rd, 5th, flat 7, and flat 2 are literally the same notes as E flat minors, 7, 2, 4, and flat 6. So you see what we're doing here. By using this second strategy of pretending it's B flat 7, we're not necessarily getting a different sound. We're getting the same sound. It's the same diminished 7 sound. The starting locations are the same, like I talked about in the previous video. It's not the sound that's different. It's the mindset that is different, right? Because in the previous strategy, you had to think of the next chord that's happening. You find the diminished based off of the next chord, E flat minor or B flat minor. With this strategy, you literally just pretend it's a different chord at that moment. Personally, I kind of like this strategy because in my own playing, I often think of other chords that aren't happening anyway. It's just kind of a thing that I personally enjoy to do. It sounds cool. So I'm already used to this. So pretending a chord that's not actually happening is the strategy that I would choose, right? Because I can just, in my mind, think B flat minor, 3, 4, B flat minor, 3, 4, B flat minor, 3, 4, B flat dominant, 3, 4, E flat minor. That to me is very easy to do. Even though it's not happening in the track, I can pretend it's happening like that. And I can slide into those sounds a little bit easier. And not to mention, those starting locations, when you're thinking about it from the perspective of the dominant 7th chord that goes into the minor chord, the starting locations are so easy to get to. 3 of the 4 notes are chord tones, right? If you're playing B flat dominant 7, something like this, just a little, arpeggio, a little chord, the 3, that's a starting location. So is the 5, starting location. Flat 7, starting location, right? All 3 of these notes, you're already playing this when you're just playing normal dominant 7. 3 of those 4 notes are starting locations for diminished. And the only one that's not a literal chord tone of B flat 7, again, is that flat 2, which is really easy to find. Just look for your root, go up a fret. So in this situation, what I would be doing is pretending 2 dominant chords. While I'm on B flat minor, during the last bar, I'm literally going to play B flat 7 and get into the diminished like that. And then during the E flat minor, I'm going to literally pretend that last bar is not E flat minor. I'm going to pretend it's F7, the 5 of B flat. And guess what? When I'm pretending it's F7, you know what notes I'm going to play? I'm going to look at Fs, 3, 5, flat 7, or flat 2. And those are all the same starting locations for my diminished 7 idea that will get me into B flat, right? Because the 3rd, 5th, flat 7, and flat 2 of F are the same as B flats, 7, 2, 4, and flat 6. Same notes. Again, you're not going to get a different sound with this strategy versus the strategy we just went through. It's a different mindset that might be easier. So I'm going to do that first. I'm going to play, actually, over the same backing track. I'm actually not even going to play the diminished 7 ideas. I'm actually going to play the dominant 7th sound. I'm going to play B flat dominant, taking me into E flat. And then I'm going to play F dominant, taking me into B flat. And you'll hear that sound is pretty familiar because I guarantee you've heard these sounds before. I'm just playing them even though they're not happening in the track. Let's try it. B flat minor, right here. I'm going to pretend B flat dominant right now. Check this out. I play literally just an arpeggio, 1, 3, 5, flat 7, right? F dominant right now. Here we go. Again, F7, dominant arpeggio. Doesn't get any easier than that. B flat major right there, right? Again, not happening in the track, doing it anyway. F dominant, watch this. Taking me into B flat. Now, I'm gonna get into the diminished stuff. Watch this. I'll play one more time and then I'll describe it. Okay, so what I did right there, I got into, during the B flat dominant that's not actually happening, I got into the diminished sound by doing what? I started diminished on its third. I can clearly see that note. Here's 1, 3, 5, B flat. It doesn't get any simpler. I see the third, and I think that's a diminished starting location over this B flat dominant, the 5 of the next chord. I hit this note and start my diminished idea. The same diminished idea that I would play if I was thinking about E flats 7, right? That's the same starting location. It's the same note. Again, just the mindset that's a little bit different. The end result is the same thing, just the different mindset. And then when I played over the E flat, final bar of that, I was pretending F dominant. And what did I do for this one? I'm on E flat right there. That's the root of the actual chord I'm playing, E flat minor. And I'm visualizing in my mind F7, pretending the 5 of the next chord, B flat minor, even though it's not happening, pretending it's there. And what did I do? I saw that's F. Oh, look, the root of my pretend chord of F7. And what did I do? Up a fret to its flat 2, a diminished starting location. And resolve. Very, very simple ideas too. I'm not doing anything wild, anything crazy right here. Just practicing getting in and out of these sounds from these approaches, right? So you can see what this one is. This one is just literally pretending it's a different chord at the end of the run of minor. And what is that chord? It's always the dominant 7th built on the 5 of the next chord, right? This will work for literally any minor chord or major chord. That's a little spoiler alert to future videos, but definitely any minor chord that you will ever travel to, right? If you're traveling to D minor from something and you want to sneak in a little transition, you can play diminished on its 7, 2, 4, or flat 6, resolve to D minor, or you can pretend right before this chord happens that you're playing its 5, which would be what? Up a power chord, down a 4th, dominant, so A7 in this case. That will always work, right? In this particular progression, it's actually pretty convenient, which you might already notice. Why? When we're playing B flat minor and we're going to E flat minor, right? What chord are we pretending? E flat's 5 chord, which is what? B flat dominant, like we just did. Well, that's actually really convenient because all we're really doing is we're playing B flat minor and then we're turning it into B flat dominant. The root's not even changing. It's still B flat. A lot of the notes are even similar, right? We're still playing the 5. We're still playing flat 7. We're just making sure we're playing this major third now, right? That's kind of what we talked about earlier. The reason why this note is so strong, because it's the major third of the minor chord that's happening, right? Giving you that sort of sound. So just mentally, it's pretty easy to get into it because the root's not changing. You're just going from B flat minor to B flat dominant in your head, and then you resolve to E flat. And then, of course, the next one is a different chord. That would be F7, not a chord happening. But that chord is also pretty common too, right? F7 to B flat minor. If I played B flat minor, E flat minor, F7, that's called a minor blues, right? Those chords are pretty common. So if you're pretending these chords are not happening, right? Or pretending these chords even though they're not happening, the actual moves that you're playing are pretty common. So there's a good chance you're already playing these moves. You're now just doing them in a progression where they're not happening. You are making them happen in your lead, right? So that's the idea with this. A lot of cool stuff that you can come up with, and it's really just finding the right mindset that works for you. Again, me personally, I like to pretend that dominant 7th chord before the chord happens. For whatever reason, I think I like it. And it kind of gives me some more ideas because there's a bunch of other stuff you could do within those dominant 7 sounds. But that's the strategy, right? Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about that is kind of interesting. If you are, let's say, writing, maybe a solo section of a tune or a backing track or something, and you want more opportunity to sit on this diminished 7 sound because you really like it, instead of just having a loop of the 2 minor chords like we've been doing, what you can actually do is put in the actual track those dominant 7 chords that I was just thinking about, right? Even though now I'm not pretending they're happening, they're actually going to be happening, right? So I've actually redid the backing track to put in those dominant 7 chords. So now the backing track, I'll just play it real fast so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. The backing track is going to be literally B flat minor and then B flat dominant and then E flat minor and then F dominant, right? We have the minor chord, turns into the 5 of the next minor chord, and then the 5 of the next minor chord, and then it loops. I'll play that. You can check out what it sounds like. It's the same track, just with that injection of a different chord. B flat minor, right? And watch this, B flat 7, right? E flat minor. We're gonna hear an F7 come up right here, right? So because those different chords are happening, the diminished stuff is gonna fit perfectly over that, just like this. It fits perfectly right there because it's actually happening. It's not just me playing it, the whole track is playing it. It's a little bit more inviting now that it's actually going on in the track. You can also kind of start to get into a little bit more involved licks that really dig into that diminished sound, because again, the sound is actually happening now in the track, right? So that's kind of an interesting opportunity. So I think what I'm going to do is I will upload as a separate video both versions of this track. So the version with just the 2 minor chords, and then the version with the actual dominant 7 chords that will be, like I said, a little bit more inviting for this diminished 7 sound. So that's basically the idea. You kind of see how we're approaching this. With those multiple kind of different mindsets, you can figure out which one makes the most sense. I will say, depending on the exact progression that you're playing, one mindset might be better and another one might be worse, but then if the progression is different, it might flip, right? There are some contexts where always just thinking about the next minor chord, playing diminished on 7, 2, 4, 6, flat 6, excuse me, maybe that's the better choice. But then a different progression, you might say, oh no, definitely pretending those dominant 7 chords is the definite choice. It really does depend on the chord progression. But as long as you know these 2 options are available, you can experiment with these sounds in whatever way you want and get some really cool results. That does it for part 4 of my practical guide to using diminished 7. A lot of very useful ideas in here that are pretty easy to get down once you spend some time with them, and I guarantee you'll notice these sounds being played in a wide variety of players over a variety of genres. Of course, keep your eyes open for that backing track that I will upload pretty shortly on the channel, which will have both tracks that I talked about in this video. And as usual, if you enjoy this type of instructional material, feel free to check out the Patreon at the link above or below, and I will see you guys in the next video where we start using diminished 7 as a transition into sounds other than minor.